to present today.
Okay, so it's the time. So good evening, everyone. I'm Jing. So welcome to the fourth Innovation in Linguistics talk series. Today, we are very honored to have Professor Cienki with us. So before his talk, let me briefly introduce Professor Cienki. So Professor Cienki is Professor of Language Use and Cognition and English Linguistics at Fuyin University, Amsterdam, and is the founder of the Amsterdam Gesture Center. He's also a professor at Moscow State Linguistic University, where he founded the Multimodal Communication and Cognition Lab. His research is in the field of cognitive linguistics, with a recent focus on spoken language and gestures. He is co-editor of the anthology Metaphor and Gesture and the two-volume handbook Body Language Communication. Today, his talk is entitled Speakers' Gestures and Semantic Analysis. So let's give him a big hand. The floor is yours now, Professor Cienki.
Okay, thank you, Jing. Thank you for the nice introduction. I should perhaps mention that the connection with Moscow State Linguistic University is now kind of on hold in some ways due to the current situation, but we'll see what happens in the future. But I'm actually going to mention some of the research that we were doing there. Let me get into sharing my screen so we can see the presentation here. Right. So I'll be talking, as the title says, about speakers, gestures, and semantic analysis, and basically some of the questions that this raises, looking at gesture along with looking at spoken language, and how can we think about that in terms of semantic analysis. And I'd like to start with an example, and that would be thinking about semantics in terms of reference. That's a common way that we think about meaning and to referring to states of affairs in the world, referring to ideas that we have. So I'll take that as a kind of starting point for thinking about semantics. And if we think of if someone says, I want that one, and we don't have any other information, if we don't see them when they're saying that, we might wonder what that one is. We need some more details. If we see the person saying that and they're pointing, then we get a lot more information. And so, especially also with the eye gaze, which way they're looking. So pointing then already complements the speech in terms of providing additional information and actually even more specific information about which one it is that the speaker is referring to. That one, if you think about that, these kind of deictic terms, they're quite abstract, really, whereas the gesture is quite concrete in terms of pointing to a particular direction, or if we're thinking about the context in which the speaker and the listener are interacting, then there are probably different things in the environment that they might be pointing to. And so we get greater specificity with the gesture in terms of this kind of reference. This is an example of what David McNeil, the cognitive psychologist, who's done a lot of research on gesture, what he calls speech-linked gestures. And these are gestures, as I mentioned, with especially deictic terms like this and that, where you then get additional information, for example, about size and shape of something, where someone shows that in the form of their gesture. For example, if someone says, I caught a fish and it was this big, how big is the fish? If they don't show us in some way, we don't know that information. So there's clearly information provided with speech-linked gestures that's additional to what we get in the speech alone. Let's look at then this question of what can the study of speakers' gestures contribute to semantic analysis of spoken language beyond providing this additional information with deictic words. If we start with the theoretical position in cognitive linguistics, that semantics is based on conceptual structures and different kinds of processes of construal, let's say, and forms of expression that we use provide cues for constructing meaning. This is an important starting point, because if we think about some other approaches, so let's say more conservative traditional approaches to meaning, they might view it in terms of what Michael Reddy called, actually I have this book here in 1979, there was this book, Metaphor and Thought, and this is a second edition of that, but in that book, Michael Reddy had written a paper about what he called the conduit metaphor, saying that a lot of, at least in English, a lot of our language about language and how it expresses meaning is expressed in terms of this idea that we put ideas into language and then transfer them to someone else, kind of through a conduit, as it were. But we know that that's not realistic. That's not really how language works. And the cognitive linguistic approach of saying that words and other behaviors provide cues for the addressee or the listener or the viewer to construct meaning is a much more realistic view. It's a kind of view of you could say, a constructionist view of meaning and how it works. This is actually, in some ways, not a new idea. In a talk recently by Alexander Bergs, he pointed out that some earlier scholars in linguistics had mentioned some similar ideas. He pointed out, for example, Leonard Bloomfield, publishing in the journal Language in the 1930s, wrote the following, that the stimulus, let's say the idea, which calls forth speech, leads also to some other reaction. Still other responses are visible. They do, along with speech, serve as stimuli to the hearer. These actions are facial expressions, mimicry, tone of voice, and above all, gesture. So even as early as the 1930s, Leonard Bloomfield was suggesting that we need to think of how language is working together with these other forms of expression and providing cues for constructing meaning. So what can the use of gesture reveal about, for example, mental simulation of entities and events and ideas? If we take this view of simulation semantics, that we can think of the meaning in terms of how people are construing and understanding a situation, maybe gesture can provide additional information about that, or how we use spatial imagery. If we think of gesture as a spatial medium in terms of how it's produced, but also the use of space in front of the speaker. And if people are talking about something that's has spatial elements to it, then gesture might provide additional cues to how they're thinking about that, to what they're expressing. And also, if we think of abstract concepts, that in gesture, we might also see different ways in which speakers objectify these ideas, make them in a sense as if more concrete in how they're talking about them. So let's take a look at these different points as just some examples of the ways in which gesture might provide kind of semantic information. If we take the first one, this mental simulation of entities and events, and we go back to an overview by Marquetis and Bergen, they provided a nice overview of the research on gesture and mental simulation. What they said is that meaning is embodied internally when we create embodied simulations, co-opting or using brain areas that are specialized for perception or action to reveal dynamic mental representations, rich in sensory motor detail. So the idea is if we're thinking about something happening in the world, then we might start to get visual imagery of that. Or if we think about doing something, we might already start kind of activating some of that nervous system in order to, as if, do those actions in some way. Maybe we can see evidence of that in gesture. So let's look at this in terms of a specific example. And here I'll turn to some work that we did at Moscow State Linguistic University in collaboration with them. And it involves work by simultaneous interpreters who are working in an interpreting booth. And what we did is we set them up to do a small task where they would hear part of a lecture, kind of a popular science lecture, either in Russian, where they would interpret it into English, or in English and they would interpret it into Russian. We also work with Russian and German as another pair of languages. But they only got the audio recording of the lectures. So here you see a kind of the laptop sitting down here, and excuse me, the speaker, the interpreter, would only hear the original speaker. they didn't see the video. We did that on purpose because we wanted to see what the interpreter would do if they're not influenced by, let's say, the gestures of the original speaker. So they heard the lecture in the headphones. And here you see 3 different views of the interpreter. This is a frontal view, and that's being recorded by a small GoPro camera that's sitting in front of the interpreter. There's a view over the shoulder, and that's being recorded by a larger Sony camera over here. Then there's another view, and this is what the interpreter sees because they're wearing these special glasses. These are motion tracking glasses for motion visual eye tracking research. And so here we see what the interpreter sees, and sometimes you see a little red dot moving around. That's the focus of their vision. And in this case, the interpreter is looking into an empty classroom that's there. So there's no one there in front of them. So they're really just there with their own thoughts. And that's one of the reasons I want to use examples from this now, because it's an unusual situation. But we see that the person is still gesturing. So the interpreter, in this case, is interpreting from English into Russian. And here's, I'll give you a little preview. Here is the text that the interpreter is hearing. This is the part of the lecture that they're hearing. Where, excuse me, the speaker is talking about the species that were dying out, millennia ago, and about evolution and this kind of topics. And he's talking about dinosaurs. So here he mentions the dinosaur Tyrannosaurus Rex, called here just T-Rex. And he was talking about how they can do research on, for example, what was the physical force of the bite of the dinosaur. And he says that they can make a 3-dimensional model of this in a computer, and then they divide it up into different components. So it's rather technical what he's describing there. Here is then what the interpreter says in Russian, and here is a translation of that into English so that you can also follow along. So I'll play the video, and you'll see what the interpreter does, and then we can look at it in a few separate parts. So here's what the interpreter does with this text here.
И каким образом вы рассчитываете силу укуса T-Rex? Это сканирование черепа и создание трехмерной модели в компьютере, естественно, которая затем разделяется на целый набор различных элементов.
So you might have noticed a few different things going on there. If we take this beginning part, it says, how do we calculate the force of this dinosaur's bite? And then with that, he's already showing us this kind of form here with the 2 hands kind of going together as if modeling this the jaws of this, this dinosaur and how it might be biting something. But then he turns to thinking about modeling the skull. And here he makes a different kind of gesture as if, as if holding something perhaps, or maybe the hands are the model in some way. And then he says these can be divided into different components. And then we see the 2 hands separate apart after that. So what we have here is this interpreter is gesturing about these things, even though there's no one viewing him other than the cameras, it's true, but there's no audience there. It's not like he's using the gesture in order to get his point across better to someone else. This is a case where it really seems to be visualizing his own thoughts, as it were, in terms of what he's talking about. So on the one hand, we have this first kind of, the jaws there in a certain way, excuse me, representing, kind of embodying the jaws of the dinosaur, as it were. This is one of what Cornelia Miller has called one of the modes of representation, or different facets of representation in gesture. The other instance then is as if holding something, or sometimes it's like molding something, moving it around with your hands. Another one of these modes, or in the last case, as if separating things, and you're acting as if you're doing something. So all of these are different kinds of modes of representation, and we see then in the physical forms how the speaker might be imagining what they're talking about, in a sense, mentally simulating these ideas. Here's another context, another interpreter interpreting a lecture from German into English. And here the lecturer was pointing to graphs that pointed out how different species of birds were dying out over time. And so here's the interpreter sitting alone in the booth again. There's nothing, there are no props around him. But yet when he's interpreting this, this point, where he's talking about the data and the losses of the number of birds indicated in red on the chart, there's no chart there, but still this is what he does here.
Вы видите то, что данные потери, они обозначены красным на схеме.
So if we look at that again,
Вы видите то, что данные потери, они
so
обозначены.
you see these little kind of pointing gestures he does, and even looks off to the side there. And so we have this instance where he's then perhaps simulating the speaker, the original speaker, and what they might have been doing at that point. So we have a different kind of simulation here, not simply of the referent, but even of the bigger context, let's say the speaker of the source text, the lecture that he's hearing there. This gives us a different sense of what mental simulation might involve. It could also involve viewpoint. So let's say the viewpoint of the speaker and what they might have been doing in that given context in terms of pointing to something at that moment. And if we go back to what Langacker said about construal, he says that our ability to conceive and portray the same situation in alternate ways is a facet or factor of this process of construal. That linguistic meaning involves both the content, the reference, let's say conceptual content, and the construal imposed on that content. So it's not simply about kind of more neutral reference to things. There's always a perspective that's involved. And he says, this construal involves, for example, how specifically we talk about whatever it is, the referent is, how much we put in the foreground or the background. So we saw like the other interpreter highlighting certain aspects, you know, the model, putting it there right in front of himself, prominence, so salience, and then this question of viewing arrangement, perspective, subjectivity. So here we see the interpreter taking on a subjective perspective, doing some pointing, giving us a sense of how the original speaker might have been talking about this. And again, there's no one viewing him at the moment. It's really for himself. And this is a special facet of what especially simultaneous interpreters do, where they then take on and they kind of blend their own viewpoint with that of the speaker, the original speaker of the source text. It's quite amazing what they do. So we come back to this idea of mental simulation then and return to this quote that we had before, and then think about this in terms of simulation semantics, which a number of authors have written about. And if we then take that point of view, we then think, well, it seems like gesture should play some role in terms of providing us cues, information about the kind of simulation that is involved in terms of the meaning that's being expressed. Let's take another example then in terms of thinking about spatial imagery itself, spatial relations. And I'd like to give some examples from research that used this children's book called Frog, Where Are You?, which is a picture book. And the idea is that, you know, people might, parents might use it and tell stories to their children, or they might have the children tell stories about what was going on. And so here we see a case where the dog is running away and there are bees that are flying after the dog, and the boy that was with the dog fell over, and here's an owl, and there was like a hole in the tree and the owl is coming out of the tree. So there's a lot of action happening in these pictures in this picture book. And in the research, if we just focus on this owl here for a moment, the bird, in English, we might say the bird flew down from out of the hole in the tree. If we take another language like Spanish, for example, they package the information in a different way. And so we have in Spanish, the Spanish example, and here's a translation into English, you know, the bird has exited the hole of the tree, flying towards below. So the information is broken up differently in this way, whereas in English, we have the manner expressed with the verb. How did the exiting happen? It happened through flying. In Spanish, that manner appears with a separate element, a kind of participle of the verb flying here. Whereas the path in English is expressed with this preposition. In Spanish, the path is incorporated into the verb. We have that option in English, like we can say exited, which would be similar. So this different packaging of information is, of course, what Talmy and Slobin referred to as satellite framed languages. Some languages do this, where they break up the information, putting the matter with the verb and the path in a kind of satellite, the preposition. And some languages do it in the reverse way, where then they frame with the verb the path. So we get this kind of distinction. This has provided the basis for a number of studies on gesture as well, to then see, is there any correlation in how people gesture about these events, depending on what kind of language they're speaking typologically, according to these categories. So David McNeil, if we go back to his work and some of his PhD students who went on and now are now professors in their own right, like Sota Makita and Asi Özerek, they did a study following this kind of paradigm that McNeil used of having people watch a cartoon that has a lot of action in it, and then describe what they saw, and then seeing how their gestures differ according to the languages they speak and other factors. So here's one little excerpt from that cartoon that was used in particular. Let's see what's happening here. So here we have the cat, which is Sylvester, and he's figuring out a way how to catch the bird, which is in the building across the way. And so here we have the bird, Tweety bird, and we see the ingenious way the cat tries to catch the bird in the following scene. So he was not successful, but what he tried to do here is swinging, as we would say in English, from the one building to the other on the rope, from trying to get to the building where the bird is. So in English, we have this nice verb swing, which then gives us the motion, and it also gives us how this happened. It's a particular kind of motion. If we look at verb frame languages, then they're going to break up this information differently, and then use, like we saw with the Spanish example, some kind of verb of go across, and then maybe add an element to mention that it was by swinging. Whereas in English, we simply have the one word swing, and we can then say swing across. So the path gets expressed in across. They looked at the gestures of the speakers when they were talking about this and looked to see, did they make an arc, this kind of tracing movement, another mode of representation, this kind of arc, curved movement. Did they make an arc and also a straight line? Or did they simply make a straight line between the two buildings, as if they were talking about them in space in front of them? And what they found is that the English speakers overwhelmingly, of course, there's not a huge amount of participants, but overwhelmingly only made this kind of arc movement. So they said swing and then did something like this. Whereas the Japanese and Turkish speakers either used a combination where if they made an arc, they also made a straight line, or they sometimes only made the straight line, as if from the one building to the other. So what this shows is this distinction in a kind of small scale study of how the typological category in which these languages fall correlates with the use of gesture. So it again relates to this kind of thinking for speaking idea, that if they're thinking for structuring the event in the language that they're using, what categories does that language have? That then might appear in terms of how they are visualizing the event itself and what they're focusing on, this construal idea, what they're highlighting, and how they express that in their gesture. So this is just one example where we see the kind of spatialization of information going with the linguistic factors as well. So that it could then express certain kind of features of the semantics that are involved in what they're expressing. Let's take another category, how we think about abstract ideas and abstract concepts and express them. And we see, and in many cases, this representation and gesture of abstract ideas as if they were something physical. Again, we think of these different modes of representation we can use to talk about physical things and how they might be used even when talking about abstract ideas that have no physical structure. If we go back to David McNeil's work, which I mentioned earlier, back to 1985, his paper in the journal Psychological Review called So You Think Gestures Are Nonverbal, where he started introducing his ideas and then later published them in greater detail in his 1992 book, Hand in Mind, which is a book that got many people started on doing gesture research. He noticed that when the people were describing this cartoon, so he uses paradigm of having people describe the cartoon for a lot of his studies. He noticed that sometimes when they were saying something like it was a Sylvester and Tweety cartoon, that they would then do something, put their hands in a way in front of themselves as if, if you think of this is the active side of our hands, and if they're both facing each other, that might be how you hold something or touch something in front of you. And he noticed this happening repeatedly. And he said, this seems to be almost like that conduit metaphor that I mentioned before. It's as if the genre, the cartoon here, is being presented as something that can be held in someone's hands. So this is where we have this kind of metaphor in the gesture, that the genre is as if a thing that you can hold and as if present to someone else, to the listener. We see this in other ways, though, also, like with time expressions, for example. In a study that Cooperrider and Nunez did, where they looked at, they gave people stories that they had to then read and then tell to someone else. So in this case, the participant had a story about, imagine the history of the universe taking place in one day. So what would happen if you compress the history of the universe into one day? How long would each different parts of that history take? So in this case, the speaker was talking about the what occurred in the early morning versus the early afternoon. And so the galaxies developing and things. And when she did that, she made this gesture, then moving from one side to the other, kind of tracing a path across. So there's nothing spatial itself about time, but it seems that we often use this kind of lateral reference framework for talking about time and representing that spatially. Here's another example from a TV talk show, an American talk show, where the host is talking about Stevie Wonder, the singer Stevie Wonder, and his concert coming up and how he's going to sing the different songs in one of his albums from beginning to end. And so he does the following here.
But for his concert this year, he's doing, I think, from beginning to end, songs in the key of life.
So the album called Songs in the Key of Life. And he does this gesture twice, tracing this path from left to right. Again, the performance of a series of songs doesn't have a left to right structure, but we often think of, if we think of also how music is traditionally written, a score going from left to right, and we think of the timeline we use for reference and teaching children about time and things. So we often spatialize time in that way visually, and then here we see that again coming across in the gesture. And there's actually been a lot of research on time, representing time in terms of a line in different languages and different cultures, and not only from left to right, but then also, of course, in Chinese, we have some speakers doing vertical kinds of gestures as well. So we see different ways in which time is spatialized as some kind of line, which we then also see speakers producing in their gestures in different ways. This is one of the ways in which we see abstract concepts being expressed in gesture. And back in 2008, Cornelia Miller and I edited a volume on this very topic, looking at the many different ways in which speakers objectify their ideas and then represent them in gesture. So this is another kind of mental simulation that we have, interestingly, not only of things that we might have seen physically, but of abstractions that we can imagine, and then they are as if turned into objects or relations or movements that we can express in gesture. So we have these different capacities for gesture, these different ways in which gesture works. And one of the questions that you might ask is, can or should the meaning of gestural expressions count as part of semantics? So we start getting into what's the border of linguistic inquiry, really? Does it include gesture or not? And there are various debates about this. If we go back to the early theories of the linguistic science, so Ferdinand de Saussure in the early 1900s, and his famous book that the students wrote of his lectures, this introduction to linguistics and semiotic theory, then he started with this model of, okay, if we say we have a concept and then we have some word for it, here's the Latin word, for example, arbor for tree, that in a way it's a sound, but it provides a kind of different image in an abstract sense, a kind of sound image representing that concept. And then there's a question of how arbitrary is that very connection. This is what Langacker picked up on in his representation of the linguistic sign, thinking of a semantic pole and a phonological pole. So the meaning and the expression and how they are tied together. And the question that then arises here, okay, if we have elements of spoken language that are part of this phonological structure that's clear, but then should gestural elements also be included in that? And this is the kind of question that we're dealing with today. So if we take that model of the sign and then go back to how Langacker talked about it in his 2008 kind of overview, his basic introduction to cognitive grammar, he said grammatical structures may include both the full phonetic detail of an utterance, so as it's spoken, as well as any other kinds of signals, such as gestures and body language. So he really took a broad view of what should fall under this phonological structure. It's not simply phonology as we normally know it in linguistics. He was saying we should consider different forms of expression. And he actually elaborated his model in a later paper. Here's a kind of adaptation of that, where he said, well, the expression side can include not only segmental content, so that, kind of morphemes or, phonemes and these different elements, but also prosody and gesture as different forms of expression. And then on the conceptualization side, we have, of course, the reference that we're talking about, but then more abstractly, the information structure itself, what ideas we're presenting, what's new, what's old information, and how we're managing that conceptually in speech. So he tried to present a more complex model of how we can think about the linguistic sign. But I see a number of problems, issues, challenges that come up when we think about the dynamic nature of spoken language and gesture. For example, different time scales are involved simultaneously, and we'll take a look at that. We're dealing with moment by moment expression of words and gestures as we're producing them, but we're also putting them into phrases in different ways. So if we think of, we have in English, we talk about intonation units, for example, idea units, and then we also have gesture units, which might occur across a number of words. And then we have larger chunks of discourse. In terms of writing, you might say the paragraph level. So larger levels that are working at the same time as these smaller levels. And we see that visually in gesture playing out in different ways. So there's some complications for how to think about the linguistic signs and how they're working. It creates some new questions. And I'd like to use some examples now from a database from the University of California, Los Angeles library, their broadcast newscape, as it's called, and that can be researched with different tools from this distributed network of researchers, so-called Little Red Hen Lab, and see from that examples from television broadcasts that were recorded with the closed captioning. So usually for the deaf and the hearing impaired, they have the subtitles, and that then being recorded with the video allows you to search the video in different ways for use of different words or expressions, for example, and then see what people are doing when they say those things. So let's take this first level, the kind of moment by moment level, and take an example. This is from the actor Kenneth Branagh, and he was saying in a talk show that how you think about your judgments and decisions, you might debate whether they should be balanced in different ways, kind of abstract thought here. Let's just hear him saying that for the moment.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make that balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
So, okay, that's fine. Also notice he uses a kind of parenthetical phrase here, allows you to make balanced judgments, but then he kind of inserts a little clause in the middle there. So we see verbally, also in terms of his restart, here that there are different elements coming into play moment by moment as he's speaking. Let's see what he does here with the video clip. Here's that him saying that same thing here.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
And you might have noticed his two-hand gesture there. He's talking about balanced. And if we look at that again, and you look at the timing of how this played out.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make balanced, if that's what you think there should be, judgments and decisions?
And if you look at when he started gesturing.
But on the inside, what is it that allows you to make?
He's already started gesturing and he hasn't even said the word balanced yet. If we go back to our little transcript, it's during his in-breath here where he then is getting ready to say that. We're already getting elements of the kind of image, you know, as if you're weighing two things in your two hands before he's even gotten to saying the words. So how do we manage that in terms of our modeling of the semantics when the time scales are already playing out a bit differently for the gesture and the speech, creating a complex dynamic process? So that's one level, kind of moment by moment time scale. Let's take another example. This is the one we already had, talking about the Stevie Wonder concert, playing the songs from beginning to end, songs in the key of life. Let's just take that example again.
But for his concert this year, he's doing, I think, from beginning to end, songs in the key of life.
So we see with the phrase from beginning to end, songs in the key of life, he then repeats that gesture. It covers the phrase, as it were. And interesting that he then uses the same gesture for referring to the title of the album. And here we then kind of take that image of time as space from beginning to end and transpose it onto the title of the album. So it gives a kind of different construal of the music as if being thought of as a sequence in some way. So again, we see these different time scales playing out here on a bit larger level, a kind of phrase level. But interestingly, the gesture units often cover phrase levels as kind of idea units, as well as Chafe talked about them in intonation units. And let's take another level here, the kind of larger level, larger discourse units. And we see examples of what David McNeil called catchments or discourse cohesive gestures. And these discourse cohesive gestures are ones that then occur across several parts of a stretch of discourse. Here's an example from a talk show where Justin Timberlake was talking about an awards show where he and Ellen DeGeneres were presenting awards. And here he's now on her TV show, her talk show. She's the E and he the J. Justin is telling about what happened when they were presenting the awards. So let's hear this and you can read along as he's saying it.
If you do, funny enough, I don't know if you still have that whole clip of you two introducing me, but if you'll notice, there was someone running behind you.
No, I didn't see that.
Well, obviously you didn't see it, right?
Yeah.
But one of the stagehands comes running up and says, "They want me to switch the batteries in your microphone."
So it's a weird situation where he's already on stage at this award show, but then a helper, a stagehand, comes from behind the scenes and has to do something there, change the batteries in the microphone. And so it's kind of an awkward moment. It has to happen quickly so they don't interrupt the show. And so it's kind of a funny thing because you wouldn't expect that to happen in these professional kinds of broadcasts. So here's Timberlake then telling that same story, and let's see what he does here.
If you do, funny enough, I don't know if you still have that whole clip of you two introducing me, but if you'll notice, there was someone running behind you.
No, I didn't see that.
Well, obviously you didn't see it, right?
Yeah.
But one of the stagehands comes running up and says, "They want me to switch the batteries in your microphone."
So what you might have noticed here in this clip, and I'll go through the parts of it, is that we have the first introduction of the idea here.
If you still have that whole clip of
So he's talking about the clip, the film clip, and makes this gesture with the two hands making kind of right angles with the fingers there, holding it up. And if we think of, the old-fashioned way of thinking of film, let's say, as a kind of tangible object, the film strip with the frames and the images in it. When you take a clip of the film, it's really a piece, a stretch of this tape that you have. And we still use that way of talking about video, even if it's digital video. We still talk about a clip, for example, from a video. So here he presents that, referring to the clip itself. But then he goes on and does the following.
No, I didn't say that.
Well, obviously,
So he's coming back to the idea, but hasn't mentioned it there verbally, then does the following.
but if you'll notice, there was some.
If you'll notice, and then still does that same gesture there. And then at the end.
But one of the stagehands comes running up.
So introduces the kind of key point of the story here with the helper, the stagehand coming running up, and does it again. So what's interesting is we have the same gesture coming up 4 times here. And if we go back to how he said this, let's take a look at how he verbalizes. And here, the parts that are in yellow are where he was making this gesture. We notice that only in the first one is he referring to the clip. In the others, it was another part of the story. Here he's, at a loss for formulating his words here. And then he starts the next part of the story. But what's interesting is we get each time this recollection of the idea of film clip in the gesture. So this discourse cohesive gesture, we might call it, or as McNeill calls it, a catchment, runs across this story that he's telling and helps tie it together visually for the audience as well. And we see that it's then working on this kind of larger time scale, this sort of paragraph level of discourse. McNeill says a catchment is recognized from recurrences of gesture form features over a stretch of discourse. Catchments are recognized from two or more gestures, not necessarily consecutive, not necessarily one after the other, with partially or fully recurring features of shape, movement, space or use of space, orientation, so how are they turned, and dynamics, how is it produced? He often did this kind of beat movement on it. So the gesture ties together certain ideas in the discourse, brings back an idea, as it were, into the current discourse space, and makes the discourse space also the physical space in front of him of the storytelling. And these are often referential in nature. If you look at the research on these catchments, even if the referent isn't mentioned again verbally, like in this case, it was only mentioned at the beginning. So we have the gestures playing out with the words on these different time scales, making for a really complex dynamic system, which is what a number of people have talked about conversation as being a complex dynamic system. And here we see with gesture that adds another element to that complexity. How can we handle this adequately in semantic analysis? And that's the question that I'm still grappling with. If we go back to some other work by McNeill, his 2000, from the year 2000, his book on language and gesture, and also his 1992 book, he talks about these idea units that we're expressing. He calls it kind of a growth point of an idea, how it develops and turns into speech and gesture. And that thinking involves both imagery in some form, but also linguistic categories at the same time. So there's a kind of a dialectic, a back and forth between these different forms of thinking in imagery, but then also thinking in terms of the linguistic categories that we have to use to express our ideas in whatever language we're using at the moment. And this dialectic then, he says, means that the word use and the grammar and the gestures, they're influencing each other in some way. And it's interesting if we think of some of the examples we saw, like the balancing example, that maybe him producing this gesture even helped him come up with the word that he needed. And we sometimes see speakers looking at their gestures to help themselves in finding words that they need. So this idea of thinking for speaking that Slobodan introduced can be reconceived as perhaps thinking for speaking and gesturing. That would tie in with what McNeill was saying, that it's this process that's involving the motion and the movement while we're talking. So you might even think about thinking for writing. There's some research on what's called keystroke logging. So keeping track of when people are typing, what order they're hitting the keys in, and what the timing is of that. And some people do research on that to see how are people kind of thinking for writing. So that's even another area of research which I haven't heard about so much, but there is research on that. So if we want to consider semantics as conceptualization, then we need to also admit that only part of that conceptualization makes it into language. And some people have talked about lexical concepts, for example. But other parts make it into the gesture or the facial expressions or other things that we're doing. This takes us back to what Bloomfield said that I mentioned at the beginning. You know, this stimulus which calls for speech, this idea that we have also gives rise to other behaviors, including the gesture. If we take this question of the timescales, then the different timescales, I think it shakes up this model that Saussure had presented and Langacker had elaborated on, because this appears to be a rather static kind of model, you know, these kind of boxes one on top of another, and it seems to be a clear thing what this linguistic unit is, but maybe it's really, you know, messier than that and more dynamic. So these semantic structures and phonological structures are really dynamic structures, and we need some kind of dynamic models to analyze spoken language and gesture in use. And this is a question that remains with us. It has not been solved yet. And so it's something I'm thinking about and would like to think about more in the years to come, and maybe work out more concrete ways of showing that also and presenting that in research. So it had this, looking at gesture has been theoretical implications also for how we're looking at language. If we say that spoken language always involves at least two semiotic systems, the lexico-grammatical system and the intonation, or if we're dealing with a tonal language like Chinese, then you also have the tones as well, which are inherently part of the language and its use in spoken form. We can think of this in terms of this notion of polysemiotic communication. This is a term taken from Jordan Zlatev and colleagues. Alia Morgenstern has also used the term plurisemiotic. And I like this way of talking about it. If we think of communication as involving different semiotic systems, so we have the lexicogrammatical system, we have gesture, facial expressions, maybe posture. They work together as a bigger enterprise. It really takes us to a higher level. So then we're not just thinking about linguistic semantics, but we're thinking about communication semantics. Maybe we need a higher level of analysis to work with that. There are different pieces of a puzzle, as it were, that fit together. So maybe this model that we have, that an advancement from what we had from Saussure that Langacker presented, we should look more like this. You know, so I'm kind of joking here. It's, you know, it's obviously not a puzzle. It's something more complex, but it gives us a way to think about this. If we think of the conceptualization side and the expression side, then on the one hand, we might look at parts of that and say, for example, if we want to analyze gesture and the functions of gestures, we can take one piece of that picture, even look at gestures with the sound turned off in the video, maybe not even hear what the people are saying, and start to analyze them that way. We would need the sound for the real function, but as a kind of starting point. Or you might take a different set of elements. You might look at the lexicogrammar and the intonation together, and then see, this is maybe what we do more often in linguistic analysis, look at that connection between them as signs of some particular kind. Or we might take the intonation and the facial expressions, let's say, and look at the connections between those and how they work together. So we can see how different elements of this polysemiotic system work together, or take the whole thing, take the words, lexical items, the grammatical forms, intonation, gesture, facial expression, all this whole package together, and look at them as a group and see how they work, what kinds of meaning they're expressing. These are all different ways of approaching the puzzle of how to analyze this. And there was a special issue of the journal Linguistics Vanguard in 2017, where there were a number of chapters, articles in the volume that then approached this question in different ways of how to think about it in terms of construction grammar specifically, and say, do we need multimodal constructions, or do we need a separate kind of constructional analysis for gesture versus for language? Different solutions to that question were presented there. And if we think about, again, this complexity of the reality of what we're dealing with in, let's say, face-to-face communication for people that can see and hear and pick up on these different cues, we might sometimes be highlighting certain parts of what's happening more than others. So maybe sometimes these different combinations of conceptualization and expression are coming to the forefront more, and others are more in the background. So if you're, talking to someone through a glass wall, then you're relying more on the visual side rather than on the verbal side, versus if you're only hearing them on the phone, then you're relying on the audio cues and not getting the visual. So these different parts might come to the foreground or go in the background, depending on the context. But I think if we move our thinking up from language and gesture to the higher level of polysemiotic communication, that gives us a more complete way to analyze what's going on in face-to-face communication and figure out how our speech and gesture relating to each other, without having to say language is multimodal, that it's all part of language. I think that's too inclusive. It's putting too many things into one pot. It's then losing the distinctions between what is it that makes gesture, what is it that makes a lexicogrammatical system work in its own terms. This allows us to keep them in their own terms, but then see how they're interrelating to each other. The challenge that remains, though, is to then think about how to handle the dynamics of the use of these different semiotic systems, and how to handle them in our analyses of them as well. And that's something that that's an ongoing project then, to figure out how that works. If someone has suggestions, that would be great. I think maybe animations would be useful also in helping visualize this in some of our analyses. But I think that's a future project waiting to be really teased apart and worked out in greater detail. So I will wrap it up at that with an acknowledgement to the funding for the research on the interpreters. And here's my contact information. I also want to mention that in January, there's going to be a winter school course that I'll be teaching online on gestures and how to analyze forms, meanings, and functions of gestures. So if you're interested in that, you can just look online for the VU and the graduate winter school course. And also we have a master's course, a master's program I can mention in case any bachelor students are looking for study on multimodal communication, a one-year program dealing with not only speech and gesture, but also text and image, of course on metaphor included as well, looking at different genres of communication. So that's a little advertising there for those as well. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Alan. So that's a very interesting and inspiring talk. Okay, I guess we have so many questions from the audience. Okay, so dear audience, if you have any question, you can turn on your microphone or your video and talk to Alan directly. Or if you are too shy, you can just type your question here in the chat box. Okay. Let me start with the first question.
Okay.
Okay, so this question may sound a bit superficial, but I would like to ask. So I guess for gesturing, there must be some individual variation or individual differences. Some people prefer to gesture a lot, but some people, they don't. They refuse or they constrain themselves from gesturing. Okay, maybe holding their hands all the time. Have you met such kind of cases?
Yeah, that's a very good point, that there are big individual differences in terms of how people gesture, whether they gesture in all different kinds of contexts. So context also can play a role in that. So if it's a formal context, people might be using less gesture and kind of suppressing that, where if it's an informal and emotional context, they might be using more gesture. So the same person also varies their gesture use in different contexts. That also raises questions for then how to analyze this in terms of the variability of gesture use. And that's something that has been mentioned in that 2017 special issue of Linguistics Vanguard, the point that if we think of entrenchment as a factor in what we want to call a linguistic construction, how customary, how conventional is it to use a certain form with a certain meaning? If we think of gesture and how variable it is, then that raises questions for how do we decide, is something conventional enough to be considered a construction or not? And there's a range of degrees to which a gesture can have a symbolic status. Certain gestures, if you say thumbs up, that's great. In many cultures, that's understood. Whereas, if you make some kind of form or shape, we don't know what it is, unless you tell us verbally. So there's a range of kinds of gestures, but also individual range in terms of how frequently, how extensively people use gesture. With the example of the interpreters, I can also mention that many of them were trained in a tradition where they were taught to keep their hands folded on the desk in front of themselves, because the idea is that they're not supposed to be distracting. If people see them, they shouldn't be, looking at the interpreter rather than looking at the main speaker who was talking. But we found a big range of variation in terms of whether they gestured and how they gestured. That many of them did keep their hands kind of folded there, but we have that GoPro camera that's right in front of them, so we see a close-up of their hands, and then you start seeing all kinds of small movements and what are called adapters or self-adapters, kind of rubbing fingers, pulling themselves. And of course, they're in a very stressful, tense situation, so it's known that that kind of movement, rubbing your fingers and things can relieve stress or help you moderate your concentration and stress. So clearly that might be helping them. So even on that small level, they might be doing small movements, but there's a lot of variation even in that context of interpreting. Some people were, quite theatrical in what they did, but other people didn't hardly moved at all. So that raises, challenges, I think, in terms of doing this kind of research. Also, how to account for individual variation.
Yes. Okay, thank you for the explanation. So Thomas, do you want to say something?
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Cienki. I'm not expertise in any way in gestures, but I'm curious about a number of issues which I think could relate to cognitive linguistics. You have publications on image schemas early on. Many years ago, I suppose I read a number of articles, image schemas on street and so on. And you also claim gestures is embodied. And I remember you once claimed you heard the idea that is the meanings are embodied, especially in the spatial imagery, that is image schemas. And I was wondering how the deaf mute, they formulate image schemas and then to build on their meanings on the gestures and so on. But when you talk about gesture, do you include the gestures of deaf mute?
Oh, so it seems like you have two questions there. So one you had a question about image schemas, but then you were also asking about the deaf people. Is that right? Yeah.
They are
okay.
Deaf.
Okay. So maybe I can take the second part to begin with. So I'm looking at speakers' gestures, so people that use spoken language and what they do, and the deaf, the sign languages of the deaf, it's a separate area of research. There's clearly connections because using the hands as a means of expression, there are clearly connections. But in the sign languages of the deaf, then they have a formalized sign system that has its own grammatical structures and is quite different from the more relaxed and loose and variable use of gesture by speakers. So in that sense, sign languages, really present a topic of linguistic research to then see, how are certain forms being symbolized in terms of the forms that they're producing. And that's different than looking at spontaneous gesture where we don't, except for those emblems, what are called emblems, where you just say, hey, that's great, or, okay, or certain kinds of forms have specific meanings. Other than that, it's quite variable in terms of what people do. So that might reveal more about people's spontaneous thinking. That was David McNeil's idea also. Whereas in sign languages, you have to, if you want to say tree in American Sign Language, you use a certain kind of sign, you have to do that to say tree. You can't choose how to depict the tree. You have to use that sign for that tree in American Sign Language. So that says less about their, spontaneous thinking in the moment. It's more like a word in a language. That's the way you have to express it. There are, though, gestural elements in sign languages. And so Sherman Wilcox, for example, has done research on how people who are using a sign language then might also add, for example, as I mentioned, size and shape specifiers. They might add certain information. They might show their attitude towards something by gesturing in a different, by signing in a different space, for example, close to themselves or far away. And that might not be part of the sign system of the sign language, but a kind of gestural element of their own. So there is some research on that now, how gestures also play a role in sign language. But your question about image schemas, then, I would say there are certain patterns that we see coming up in gesture, like the use of a path, for example, tracing a path, or as if holding something like it's an entity in a container, or where we then see the kinds of patterns of the image schemas appearing in gestures in certain ways. That does appear to be the case. But many other gestures are doing something that's maybe harder to specify just in terms of an image schema. And Jordan Zlatev has done research on what he calls, I'm going to forget his term right now. He talked about how we have certain kinds of schemas that enact what someone's doing, particular actions that are more specific than image schemas. So for example, someone talks about writing, and they use their hand, the hand shape and movement like as if they're writing with a pen. Or they talk about pushing something, they do a certain action like that, that there are these kind of more specific schemas, mimetic schemas, as he called them, mimetic schemas, that, mime or mimic certain kinds of actions. They also play a role in gesture. That's a different level of specificity that's more specific than the image schemas, which are more schematic patterns. So it seems like we have different kinds of schemas that are playing out in gesture.
Yes, thank you very much. I noticed after your publication of image schemas, you also have publication on semantic schema and so on. So I was wondering, is there any advancement in the research area of image schemas? Specifically, there are any new image schemas added to the original inventory proposed by Johnson? Something like several dozen, close to around 30. I think you added one called street and so on and so forth. So is there any latest advancement on the research of image schema, especially on the specific particular image schemas and the related research? And the general view of cognitive linguistics, that is meaning constructions are embodied on the image schemas and forth.
There is some research here and there where people have proposed patterns that they think qualify as image schemas, and I'm thinking of Jean Mandler, who did research on child language acquisition, psychologist. She looked at differences between animate movement by living beings versus inanimate movement. So inanimate movement would be how a machine moves, how a kind of mechanical movement. And she found that even babies are able to recognize differences. If you put, for example, little lights, electric lights on a person, and you turn the lights out and the person moves, versus if you put the lights on a kind of, I don't know, primitive robot or machine, and that moves. And the children are, even when they're very small, are able to recognize differences in these patterns of movements. So they recognize something about the forms, maybe the curves and the dynamics of animate movement. So she proposed some image schemas related to kind of animate versus inanimate distinction. And a few other people have proposed some others, but I haven't seen a lot of research that follows up on that. So it seems like there hasn't been, maybe if there is, I haven't noticed that research that kind of collects these new image schemas. That would actually be a useful thing if someone could pull that together.
So it seems Mandela is leading a role in the research of image schemas in psychology, and yeah.
Well, this is from a number of years ago. That she had written about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to remember Christopher Hart. Is that Christopher Hart?
Yeah.
He published a few articles on the relation between image schemas and discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that area is hopeful, is a promising area to pursue, the research of image schemas?
Yeah, I think in that sense, it's you're dealing with a more abstract sense of image schemas in terms of, discourse structure and things of that nature. So that could be useful. I'm not as familiar with that kind of research, but that could be another kind of application of thinking about image schemas. Yeah. Yeah,
I think otherwise, the area of image schemas will be in sort of forgotten area.
It's true that there's not so much mention of it nowadays, and I think partly because it's hard to verify. Let's say, is this an example of this or that image schema? Maybe people could do studies where they have many people try to evaluate or rate kinds of, I don't know, texts or gestures or whatever, whether they fit certain image schemas, but it's not clear why one should do that, So It seems like it's a useful explanatory tool. It explains certain reoccurrences of certain patterns in our experience. It seems useful for that, but it's hard, I think, to apply and verify in some sense. It's sort of like, with blending theory, for a while, blending theory, conceptual integration theory, everyone talked about that for a number of years. And now, I don't know, you hear about it sometimes, but it's the same kind of thing. If someone makes a diagram of like a blending theory and saying these things were integrated, can we verify that? Do other people, would they come up with the same diagram, analyzing the same phenomenon? I don't know. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Jing, the floor. I see in the chat, there's a couple of questions in the chat as well. Maybe.
Yeah, yes, Alan. There are two questions there. Can you read the question?
Yeah, I see them. I see. So the first one was, may I ask why emotions are not included in the data showcases? Gestures are both cognitive and emotional to some extent, I believe. That's a good point. That's true. That maybe we do need to take more account of the affective side. So affect, feeling, emotion in our analyses. And that's true that I didn't mention that, but of course, language and gesture are not only referring to specific reference, but they're, as part of this construal, there's also the subjective nature of how we feel about that. So for example, are we emphasizing something or not? And whether you might present that with greater salience in the gesture or not might have to do with how you feel about that. And I haven't seen good ways to include the affective component in the analysis of speech or gesture, but that's I think a good point. One of my PhD candidates now, Michael O'Connor, is actually trained as a dancer and choreographer, and he's using the ideas from cognitive linguistics, trying to apply them in having people move in certain ways. So he's studying research in movement, doing movement analysis, and seeing, for example, how that relates to emotions, affects. And so I think that that is has potential as well in terms of making people more aware through of how they're moving, and then how that might be expressing certain emotional features or not. Could be even used in certain therapeutic contexts as well. So I think that's a very good point. Another question here, can you give me some suggestion if I want to do research about gestures in business activities? So that's a nice domain for research in terms of, it depends on what kind of business activity you're looking at. So if you're looking at business meetings, some people have done video recording of business meetings and how people are interacting in those meetings, doing kind of close qualitative analysis, maybe using methods of conversation analysis to see how the interaction is playing out and how people are moving or gesturing while they're talking. Some people look at sales pitches. So when they're trying to promote something to a potential investor, how do they talk about that? How do they present it? What some call an elevator pitch. When you have to, as in the time it takes for you to go on the lift or the elevator from one floor to another, you have to quickly talk about it and present your ideas to someone as if you were telling them in the elevator. So those are some contexts in which you could do research and gesture in business activities. Maybe if you have more specific questions, you can add them in the chat so I can address them. One methodological question concerns how to record this material. For example, how to get access to allow video recording. That might be difficult in some business settings if people are talking about confidential details that they don't want recorded and distributed. So that's something else to think about if you want to make sure you have permission from the people to record their interactions and conversations, and maybe anonymize the material. So with video recording, there are ways to make the face blurry or change their voice and things so that can anonymize the recording. So if you have any specific questions, just maybe add them in the chat. I see another question here. The same person wanted to know about the studying virtual characters. Is there any difference between human and virtual and human and real human characters? That's a very good question. There is some research on implementing gestures with virtual characters. Some people that worked in computer science, for example, Stefan Kopp has done some research on this, having avatars, for example, gesturing in different ways. It's still a field in development. It's hard to get the characters to gesture in a natural way, partly because of the variability in how we gesture. So for example, if you teach a robot or a virtual agent to gesture to present a point, they might use certain kind of presentation gestures which seem normal, but then if they do that every time, it's really artificial. We don't do that every time we make a point. We only do it sometimes. So you have to introduce this kind of variability in the gesture use, which is very complex to do. So I would say it's maybe a bit tricky with virtual characters to have them appear more natural. But if you work with some specialists in computer graphics, maybe they can help with that. I see Yuatao has a question.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hello, Professor Cienki.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Sorry, Jimmy. Just I'll take this one and then we'll come to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Yuatao.
Hello, Professor Cienki. I'm Yuatao from Renmin University.
Yes, we've talked before. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad to see that you are using examples from the interpreter examination, the experiment. And my question is that have you ever noticed any, in terms of meaning transfer, are there any verbal meaning that are conveyed in the interpreter's gesture, or vice versa? The speaker's gesture, the speaker's gestural meaning are conveyed in the interpreter's verbal translation. Have you ever noticed any sign of that?
So in this study that that I reported on, we only used the audio of the original speaker, so the interpreter wouldn't see any gestures from the source text.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. So that's in an extension study. That's the current object of research. The new data will be collected by the group in Moscow to try to then look at that that question. But for the first part of your question, was it about something different or the same thing?
I mean, the speaker's verbal information. Are there any speaker's verbal information or verbal meaning conveyed in the interpreter's gesture?
I think only in terms of some of these representations, like we saw, we're talking about the computational modeling or dinosaur, or, he was depicting things that the speaker had said. And so in that sense, the reference, are being picked up in some ways and maybe being visualized. But then it's a question of, was the interpreter doing that for themselves to help their own thinking for speaking? That's what I'm assuming, but we can't really verify that. Or were they doing it as a kind of, I don't know, is it a secondary aspect, that because they said that, therefore they gestured that. So we don't know, we can't know what leads to what, does the gesturing lead to their verbal production? Maybe looking at the timing would help us determine that. If they first produce the gesture and then say the word, that seems that the gesture might have helped. It's less common that someone says something and then they gesture it. So it's hard to know if, the source text speaker using a word, whether that led to a gesture. I think it's hard to know that. It could just be the factor of the speaker, the interpreter using the idea, and so then they come up with an image and then they gesture it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then Jen.
Yeah, I have a question. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting lectures. I have a question that is a very good point to investigate constructions with gesture. So I'm wondering if a construction has different meanings. That means a polysemous construction. That's taking C, for example. It has the meaning of both noticing something and thinking. For example, I see something. So I see, that means I understand. So will the speaker use different gesture in the speech if they come across such, the different meanings? Yeah, thanks.
It also raises questions about ambiguous or polysemous words also, so even just the word see here having multiple meanings. That's a good question. I don't know if there's, I'm not sure if there's research looking at polysemy and differences in gesture use, but I imagine there would be differences, because if someone mentions seeing something visually, they might point, and sometimes we do that pointing to the other speaker as a way to interact with them to show that they understand their idea. I see what you mean, meaning understand, as opposed to seeing something where they might be pointing at a thing, different than pointing at the other speaker. So I think there could be use of gesture that could show differentiation, or disambiguation of certain ideas. But I'm thinking of, there was some research where they had people use a term, an idiom that could have a physical meaning or that could have a metaphoric meaning. And then they told them produce a gesture. And so it's kind of artificial, and in that research, actually people produced often the same gesture with the physical meaning as with the abstract meaning. But I think the problem there is that they were told to gesture, and so then they're probably focusing on what's the word, and they're focusing on the physical meaning. And so then they actually produce the gesture related to the kind of, the source domain, the physical meaning. But I think that's a potential area for future research, kind of disambiguating meanings with gesture. Yeah.
So it means that we cannot only figure out the meaning of the verb only. Sometimes we need to connect the verb with the entities that it's referred to, right?
And certainly seeing the video, seeing what the speaker was saying, adds a lot of information that can disambiguate, that can do a lot to help make clear what was being said. So this is a problem sometimes with spoken language corpora, when they collect a lot of data from spoken language use. It depends a lot on the context of the spoken language use. So for example, there was one study in Dutch, for example, when they collected a corpus of people that were playing board games. So they were playing games at a table and moving things around with the board game. And a lot of what they said was this and that, here, there, that one, a lot of these deictic terms. But when you just read the transcript, you don't know what's going on, whereas if you saw it, it would be very clear and very simple. So partly it depends on the context in which they're talking. Yeah.
Okay, I see. I see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy, for the question. Hi, Alan. We have another 2 questions in the chat box.
Okay, I also see there's someone with the hand raised. Yating Zhao.
Okay, yes, thanks for your wonderful and interesting lecture. And I'm Yating from Nanjing University. Maybe I have the question which may be more practical. You have mentioned so many kind of gestures, and I noticed there are many pointing gesture or metaphorical gestures, right? So my question is about the B gesture. Normally, we may say that both the pointing and the metaphorical gesture as the referential gesture, because they may have the meaning we can have more specific meaning, semantic meaning specifically. But for the B gestures, many scholars, they have said this kind of gesture are void of semantic meaning, and we also call them non-referential gestures. So my question is, if we want to analyze the semantic relationship between like so many kind of gestures, so when we do the annotation, when we are confronted with this situation, should we just exclude the B gestures when doing the semantic analysis? Or if we want to include the B gesture in the semantic analysis, like what kind of semantic relationship between the speech and gestures, we can say the complementary or the reinforcing or contradictory, but what kind of semantic relationship can be between the B gesture and the spoken information? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, right, that's a good point. And you're right, I didn't mention the beat gestures for that very reason, because they usually are considered not adding so much semantic content as pragmatic information. So some people look at them as adding emphasis. So you might have a kind of pragmatic level of adding, let's say, this kind of viewpoint question, of adding information about, does someone think this is important or not? Are they putting it in the foreground or in the background? So you might include it for that element, for then seeing, was an idea emphasized or not. Sometimes a speaker produces a gesture with what's called a hold afterwards, and then they make beats on the hold. So they kind of keep the idea there, but they're still showing with the prosody, producing beats along with the rhythm of their speech. So in that sense, they might be foregrounding the idea and keeping it there in a sense by keeping the gesture there. So this also relates to that multiple time scales question. If we have these holds after the gesture stroke, that maintains the image there, but the speech has moved on to talk about other things, how do we analyze the semantics on these multiple levels at once? That's a challenge that we have to somehow work out in terms of the gesture analysis. But I would say you're right, you probably would not include it so much for the semantic side, but you could add a pragmatic element to say, these ideas are being emphasized, made more prominent.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Yep. I see there are more questions in the chat. So here's one from Yuan Meng, who says, question from Huang. I wanted to ask if want to study how spoken language, gesture, and facial expressions construct meaning together. How can I deal with the relationship among the 3 modalities? Yeah, that's the question that I'm trying to deal with. It's not easy. You can, analyze the individual components. You have the spoken language, gesture, facial expression, and then try to put them together. But you do have, if you want to there's a question of whether you want to deal with the timing of these different forms of expression or not, or whether you just want to look more simply at, let's say, a compound of, this verbal expression occurred with this kind of gesture or with this facial expression. You can simplify it and kind of exclude the temporal element. We lose some information with that, but it might be a way to begin doing the analysis. But you need some kind of system, of course, for how do you analyze facial expressions. That's very complex. There's research by Paul Ekman, on facial expressions from many years ago, where they looked at details of which muscles are being used in the face, and in certain cultures, which emotions they express, for example. So analyzing facial expressions gets at different kinds of information. It has to do more with emotions, affect, feeling, and that's different than the referential nature of spoken language, and manual gesture kind of being in between this more affective side and the referential side. But I think you would just need to have a clear system such that you can then incorporate the different elements of meaning from the different forms of expression and see how they work together. In terms of methodology, some people use the Elan software, Elan from the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. The Elan software allows you to have the video and then underneath have your transcript and your annotations that can move along with the video, so you can keep track of what matches with what. That can be helpful in doing the analysis. Then there's another question.
Maybe I can ask this in person.
Yeah.
I'm Nana Liu. I asked the next question.
Yeah, please.
I'm a professional simultaneous interpreter, and I also do research on simultaneous interpreting. Thank you for this very interesting and insightful talk. My question is about the role of audience design in the polysemiotic system, especially with regard to the simultaneous interpreting experiment. Actually, international standards require that, especially Mandarin and Russian interpreters, to work in a team of 2 and more. So, but in your experiment, the interpreters work in silo and there's no audience. And I think there may not be enough preparation time for them. So my question is, how does this, if I may say, lack of ecological validity have an impact on their gesturing? And I know that you are also doing the second round of experiments. Would you also talk with the experimentees to improve this validity in your future research? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And you raise very interesting and important points that for any experiment in a more controlled setting, you end up losing some of the ecological validity by controlling the variables. So this was our challenge, how to find out something about what interpreters do, but yet have some control over the possibilities of what they might do. So in that sense, we chose to put them there individually rather than working in pairs, as you point out, that's their normal practice. We also did not allow them to have a pen or paper. Normally they would have something they could write notes on, and we didn't allow that because partly we wanted to see how did they solve the problem of expressing their ideas when they're there just with themselves and their thoughts. So in that sense, it's kind of going beyond the normal context in a way. And so we did see them, for example, writing numbers sometimes with their finger on the table to try to capture that number for themselves. But the complexity of having the other person there is then you have another source of input. They're then being potentially influenced by the other person, looking to them, getting cues from them. That's true. That would tell us more about the actual process of interpreting, but we're studying not just interpreting, but also these questions of thinking for speaking. How do they resolve difficulties? How do they resolve disfluencies? Are they using gesture to resolve a disfluency or not? So we had particular questions, and for that we wanted to simplify the scope in which they're working But that's true. We then lose some of that, the reality of the situation. As you also point out, there's no real audience there for them to hear them. But that was, again, a factor of wanting to remove potential distraction or other features from what they're doing. So, this is a really exploratory kind of research in some ways. And I think future research could then make use of more real life contexts and then see, do the results differ much in terms of a real life situation? But I think it's a good point that with any kind of research on professional practices, to try to narrow down the possibilities of what might happen and to formalize that in some way, then we end up losing some of the, the ecological validity of the actual practice.
Thank you.
Okay. I then see a question by Yao Ru. I want to look at the gestures of teachers in online lecture videos. Some lectures are made available in the studio and the gestures are not that natural. Maybe the teachers are nervous. Sometimes the teachers hold their hands together in front of their belly for a long time. How can I analyze their gestures when they're not natural, right? So that's a good question. I guess one question would be, is that the best source of data? Maybe there's other sources of data where there might be more natural behavior, but if that's what they're doing, then if you want to talking about the ecological validity, if this is what the teachers actually did and you want to analyze it, that's their behavior, So you might look at these small movements. I don't know how good the video quality is, but you might look at those smaller, we found with speakers that were holding their hands, they would sometimes still have finger movements. They would be making beats. So they would maybe, instead of presenting a point with a full open hand, they might be raising a finger to make a point, So sometimes gestures can become miniature in form when the speakers are in a more tense kind of position. So you might look at those kinds of movements. And you might find there's even a different topic of research. If the speakers do have particular poses they keep using, maybe that lends itself to its own research question. Maybe it's different than researching more animated and larger use of gesture. Maybe there are particularities of that context that could be of use. You might also you might compare if some of the teachers do gesture more and others don't. Are there differences between how they're talking? Are they talking about different things? So there's some other research that showed that when in experimental settings where the speakers had to keep their hands still, they had to keep their hands on the arms of a chair, for example. They were not allowed to gesture, but they had to describe, let's say, the scene in a room and where objects were located and how the objects looked, that the speakers who could not gesture, they used less imagery that had to do with spatial forms. So they didn't describe as much detail of motion or forms or locations, as opposed to those who could gesture more freely, and they included a lot more spatial information. So maybe there's a difference in these lecturers, and teachers in terms of whether the ones who are gesturing versus the ones who are not, maybe they're actually lecturing about somewhat differently about the topics. That could be interesting to compare. That could be its own kind of study, actually.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for your explanation and answer to those wonderful questions. So do we have any further questions?
Hi, Jim. Before we finish, I would like to introduce two more of our assistants who are working behind the curtain today to Professor Cienki. Yuan Meng, are you here? Yuan Meng is live streaming your talk to another software, Chinese software we call Tencent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And another assistant, He Chen, is recording your talk today. Hello,
Okay.
Hello, and He Chen, you want to say hi to Professor Cienki? No voice, no voice.
Hi, Professor Cienki. I'm He Chen.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Alan. Can you hear me?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm sorry, I just typed
the last question in the chatting room from one of our audience. So do you want to ask the last one, or?
Okay. Yeah. So I see the question there, and the question is, I wonder how to construe a gesture with various theories. Would you please say something about the research framework? So I guess the question is, yeah, how to do the interpretation of the gesture, and in terms of the function or the meaning. And I've been following a tradition from work by scholars in Germany, Cornelia Miller and her group, Jana Bressem, Zava Ladovig, and a number of them have published. Actually, I also have this book here I can advertise, published in this handbook, 2-volume handbook called Body Language Communication. And there they publish their methods where they then look at, for example, forms of gestures, and then how to move from analyzing the forms to the functions. So for the forms, you can look at 4 parameters, for example, the hand shape, the orientation of the hands, which way they're facing, the location in space, where they are in front of the speaker, and the kind of movement that's made. So those 4 features can give you a starting point, and then you can look at functions according to categories like reference. Is the gesture referring to something or not? Is it depicting something? Or is it serving a pragmatic function? Or is it more serving a kind of interactive function? The issue with gesture is that gestures are normally multifunctional. So it's not that there's just one thing that the gesture is doing. So you might think of what's the more prominent function, or maybe you want to analyze and include the multiple functions. But for example, even if someone, like we had the example with showing the video clip, if you have a specific form for talking about a specific referent, you can still do that in different locations. So you can address the speaker by doing it pointing towards them, or you can do it in a more prominent space or in a lower space to show what's more important or less important. Or so these different form aspects can help you say something about the meaning. But the guidelines in the handbook provide a kind of starting point for thinking about how to do gesture analysis. And then the next question is, why are you doing the analysis? What's the theoretical question you have that leads you to that? And then that's the kind of next step, whether you're working with a kind of cognitive linguistic questions about language and thought, or whether you're working with more communicative issues about gesture and interaction. That's a separate kind of research. So that would be another element to think about.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Alan, again. So I guess that's the last question, huh? Okay. So it's a hard work after a long talk, and you answered, I guess, almost 10 questions, maybe more than 10. Okay, so thank you again, Professor Alan Cienki. That's a very wonderful talk. I guess more and more teachers and students, they have found their interest in gesture. So at the end, let's thank Professor Alan Cienki again, and also thank the audience for your staying with us, and also thank the team who work together all the time. Okay.
So you want the audience to turn on their screen?
Okay, so
if you wish. No, but thank you. Yeah, so thank you also for putting this together and organizing this this series. I'll also be interested to hear about the other lectures and to also read the other articles from their talks.
Yes.
So we are looking forward to reading the manuscript.
Yes, I will work on that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to say goodbye. So the
Okay.
audience, welcome to open your camera if you want to say hello. I guess some of your previous PhD students, they are online. I saw their names there. Okay. Okay. So have a nice